Creek. Actually, I talked to people all over the states and really enjoyed the feedback. Get a lot of contacts over the year. Elizabeth did a nice introduction to what I do at the station. When we get back to more normal times, past the COVID things, you're more than welcome to come out to the research station. There's a lot of projects going on there. We have a 350-acre station there, do a lot of work with vegetables, tree fruit, grapes, blueberries, and field crops. So just open invitation when we're back to normal. This evening, I'll be talking on growing fruit trees at home. And those of you that have fiddled with tree fruit on your own know that there's a lot involved there, and way more than we could cover in the hour, that a little bit less than an hour that we have here. But so I'm going to skim over and cover some of what I consider the most interesting parts, the parts I think that would be of most use to you. And in some respects, growing a fruit tree is just like growing a big tomato plant. But there's a lot of similarities, but there's a lot of differences too. So I'll be talking about site selection, how to modify it, soils and plantings, common pests, maintenance care, pruning concepts. I know pruning is a question that comes up quite a bit, so I'll be spending a fair amount of time on that. So hopefully everybody will find some things that they're interested in. And again, submit questions. And if after this meeting is over, you want to follow up on something that I talked about or some additional questions, I'll have my contact information on the last slide. And so you can use that to get in touch with me. So with that, I'll launch right ahead. And first of all, in Michigan, we know that weather is our friend and also our enemy. And if we look at the tree fruit, we know that there are differences on how susceptible the tree fruit are to cold damage. And this really dictates a lot on our choice of what we might plant in the backyard. And so if the stone fruit as a group, that includes the apricots, cherries, plums, and peaches and nectarines, they're more sensitive to cold. And the most sensitive of them all are peaches and nectarines, and where we start seeing damage at around -13 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's enough to kill flower buds. And then if you go up the line, they're about the same as sweet cherries and plums. Tart cherries a little bit tougher. Apricots are even tougher. And this is midwinter. And pears and apples are the toughest of all, -30 about. That is kind of the killing temperature for that. There's a lot of things that would come in and modify this thing if we had a warm spell in the middle of the winter, if the trees were weak to begin with. But this is a kind of a general rule that we look at. If we look at the outside temperature, we can predict what kind of problems we may or may not have. Where this comes in, and I apologize for the fuzziness of this picture, but this is supposed to show a little slice out of the lower part of Michigan. And this is a somewhat older map showing the Michigan hardiness zones. If you take the information I just gave you about the sensitivity of cold, of the various tree fruit to cold, and you match it up to our hardiness zones, you can see why commercial orchards plant certain types of trees where they're at. Right along the lake, where we get the lake effect, that we get the buffering effect, providing that the wind goes, in the prevailing direction. If it comes up from the south, then all bets are off for this protection on the lake shore. And as you work your way in, you get away from the zone that is considered ideal for the more sensitive ones, and vinifera grapes in that more sensitive group as well. And then you get into the zone. If you drive that area and go away from the lake, then you start picking up, well, there seems to be more apple and pear there, and the hybrid grape and the juice grapes tend to be in here. But there are various places that are colder, like Kalamazoo has a kind of a interesting warm zone there. and I'll be talking a little bit about that. But so if you match it up to the temperatures of right along the lake shore, very typically we can get -5 degrees. And with that, most of our tree fruit will pull through. Now, if you start getting into this purple zone here, then you start getting into this, well, fairly reliable -10 to -15. So it would be more challenging to grow something like peaches in this zone. And this is in general. But the other thing that we have to figure into it, and this has relevance to people that, want to push the envelope a little bit in planting trees. This is a kind of a topological graph of that same general area. And the bluish colors are the light blue colors indicate low elevation. And it's interesting, if you notice, you get away from this, shows you the Benton Harbor area here, the Kalamazoo area over here. What you'll notice is that there is some significant hills, kind of a ridge area. We call it the Keeler Ridge area here, where some growers are very successful in growing some of the more sensitive stuff. And and the other thing is to notice that the areas close to the lake have the disadvantage in that they're relatively flat growing area. Now there's exceptions in there, but that is the rule. Now where this is important, and many of you know this already, that on still nights, the cold air tends to go downhill, warm air is higher up. So as a result, if you have a hill, you can sometimes pull through a relatively cool night. Or if your backyard has a nice air drainage, maybe their fruit trees would do okay on the high part, but down low they might have problems. So this allows us to kind of think about planting decisions in terms of that. And if we think about fruit in general, and this is where fruit are like tomato plants, is that fruit trees need about 6% full sun. All day sunlight is best. They like a good garden soil, maybe a little bit more sandier is a little bit better than a little bit heavier soil. Good water drainage is very important, especially when you consider the roots go down quite a ways. Soil pH, if you are slightly less than 7, so slightly acid soil is best. They can tolerate a little bit wider range than that. Now the cranberries and blueberries are kind of the exception, where they require pH below 5.5 and actually do best when it's close to a little bit lower than 5. And in the tree fruit, tart cherries as a group are somewhat intolerant of low pH. So they will start to have problems due to some of the actually a toxicity due to some of the soil components, manganese toxicity that becomes more available at low pHs. So on this general theme, well, okay, where can you plant your material? What things would do well? We also have to think about how tolerant trees are to soil water conditions, and same as being cold, sensitive. The peach, nectarine, apricots do not like poorly drained soil. And Mahaleb is a kind of a deep taproot cherry rootstock. It does not do that well. Mazard, we use that under, does a little bit better under wet conditions. And if you go up, Concord grape is pretty tough. Apples and pear pretty tough as far as poorly drained soils. They don't like it, but they'll do better than others. And with plums, it depends quite a bit on the rootstock. They're kind of in the cherry range. So that allows us to, when you start to think about your backyard and what you can do, consider the sensitivity of rootstocks. You do have some tools at your disposal to kind of combat it. Building a mound or a berm where wet soil is a problem will help. If you really have the bucks and the time, having it tiled properly really helps. And I won't go into that now. But the goal is, once you've done either a mound or a berm that after everything all settles down, you should have at least 6 inches of rise to where the plant is. And that allows a place for the water to drain away from the top 6 inches of soil to lower down where it's less of a problem away from the major roots. So that's a really good strategy that you can use if you have heavier soils. Another consideration when you pick what you're going to plant is when they ripen. And apples are a good example of that. For example, Macintosh take about 146 days from the bud opens to harvest is in average. And whereas on the other end, Fuji, one of the later ripening varieties, takes 183 days from first green to harvest. So then if you match that up to the growing areas, Traverse City averages on the order of about 150 frost-free days. And Benton Harbor is somewhere around 170. Now we might have a bit more than that with the warmer temperatures that we've been having in recent years. But through this, you can see that Honeycrisp is kind of on the edge of the variety that latest variety that you'd go with in the Traverse City area, whereas Benton Harbor does pretty well most years with most varieties that we throw at it. There are a few ones like Granny Smith that some years it has a little bit of problem. There has been development of earlier ripening strains of things. There's an earlier ripening Honeycrisp, and there are earlier strains of Fuji. And so you can have those type of fruit, and even if you don't have a long growing season. So all this is kind of, again, allowing you to think about the choices when you're putting plants in the ground. I wanted to spend a little bit talking about fertilizing fruit plants too, once we're on the subject of soil, and that I get a lot of questions on this, so I wanted to spend some time on that. So the kind of the old style orchards, what we call the semi-dwarf trees, if you average it across all soil types, about 100 pounds of actual nitrogen per acre. Now, actual nitrogen, you have to look at the bag that you use and figure that out. So, for example, this all-purpose fertilizer down here is the NPK, the first one is nitrogen. So that's 10% nitrogen. So if you want 100 pounds of actual nitrogen, you actually have to put on 1,000 pounds of fertilizer per acre to get that 100 pounds of actual nitrogen. And the other point is that we use this terminology in tree fruit, the drip zone of the tree. And that's where after rain, you see all the rain dropping down. And so that kind of demarcates where we'd like to get the fertilizer. That corresponds pretty well where the roots are in the fruit tree. So we recommend to put the fertilizer in the springtime rather than the fall. Apply maybe half of it, especially if you have sandy soil in March and April, the other half just after bloom. Now here's a kind of the calculations. I won't spend too much about calculations in this presentation, but I think it's important to think about. So if, say you plant a young tree and you say, okay, the roots could go out about 2 foot from the tree, so what does that mean in terms of application for a small tree? So you just do you plot your math and say, okay, the area under that tree is pi r squared is 12.5. And the other point is that a cup of fertilizer is about a half a pound thereabouts. And so if you want to do calculations, if you put a cup of fertilizer per tree, that works out to about 100 and of the 10-10-10, that if you treated the whole orchard that way, just solid, every bit of ground got treated that way, that would end up being 174 pounds of actual nitrogen. And this is, then you say, okay, how much actual bags of fertilizer, that's 1,700 pounds of fertilizer in that acre. So now if you, but another way to look at it, how much do you really need to put underneath that tree? Is that if you do the calculations to get that 100 pounds actual nitrogen is about a half a cup, which is about 9 tablespoons of nitrogen. So the way you look at it is, okay, what nitrogen will actually the tree see in that next year or two, and you figure the area, and that, so that works out. But I also want to illustrate the point, if you use a different nitrogen formulation, like a 34% ammonium nitrate, if you put that amount, you would be putting on 1 cup per tree. That would end up being nearly 600 pounds of actual nitrogen per orchard for 7, way more than would be needed. The actual amount that you need would be about 2.5 tablespoons. So in general, people put on way too much fertilizer. And if you have a very rich soil, you may not need to put any on it at all. So this is kind of the rate if you're in a site that doesn't have a lot of nitrogen to begin with. And hopefully that makes sense to you. The other point I'd like to make is that you have to consider how many trees you have per acre. So if your trees are real close together, then you really need less fertilizer per tree. That that makes logical sense. And so the amount of fertilizer that you'd put per tree would be a lot more with something like this versus something like this. The reason being, with the small trees, you put an application down and some of it actually gets to its neighbor. So so think about that when you put down fertilizer. It makes a difference when how big the trees are and how old they are. I'm going to say a few things about insect and disease control. I get a lot of questions on this. And so I want to give you some general principles. And I'm using apples as an example here. This is where in an apple, we go from the first green, dormant first green, and pink bloom, and then we start in about June, start having fruit out there. And it's that period of time where the focus should be on protecting, early on, protecting leaves and stems. Later on, when the fruit appears, then the focus should be toward protecting the fruit. And what you do in terms of materials out there should take that in consideration. First of all, you can lose about 10% of your foliage to leaf spot and so forth, even holes from insects, and not affect fruit production. Now, you don't want to get way more than that, but that's kind of a general rule of thumb. So you don't get all excited about a little bit of damage out there. Okay, the other point is that pests that attack the fruit are a bigger concern than foliage feeders, because it doesn't take much damage on fruit before you start to regret it. It's easier to control the pest populations when they are small, so you have to plan ahead on that. Don't let things get away from you, and know that certain pests and pathogens tend to be active at certain times of the year. So a little bit of education on insects and diseases is useful. And the other thing is that treatments are only partly effective. So if you put a material on, there will be some that escape. There maybe some of them are not affected at all. And so there's going to be some carryover. So you can't let your guard down if you put an application on and think that you can just forget about it for the next couple of weeks. And the other point I'd make is that the fruit don't have to be perfect. So, especially in the backyard situation. So, okay, let's look back at that again in terms of a general spray program. The main thing on apples that we worry about, the main disease, is apple scab. And so we worry about that from about tight green, tight cluster through petal fall. And then if we do a halfway decent job, we don't have much carry through of that disease. So a typical approach might be to target maybe three sprays in that zone for scab season. If you have a powdery mildew susceptible variety, then that kind of kicks in close to bloom. So that's kind of the general, that's your disease control program early in the year. Again, you don't worry much about insects at this time unless you have an unusual situation. And then in the summertime, you do the cover sprays, focusing on probably the first month and a half after that insects after bloom, when the fruit out there, tends to be the most concern. So you can target that with 1 to maybe 3 sprays. So maybe a total of 6 sprays, you would do a fairly decent job. Now you may be laissez-faire about this and you say, well, I'll take the damage that I get, and so be it. You can pick varieties that are more resistant to diseases that will help somewhat, but it won't carry the day. A little bit about materials out there. If you go and look in the Lowe's and other places like that, you'll see the usual things show up again and again. And the ones that are kind of a mainstay is Captan, gets used a lot. Myclobutanol is one that's called Immunox. There's a couple of different formulations of that, but it's that one's a pretty good scab material. And so with scab, copper is and sulfur are organic materials, and so they won't be as effective as these two materials, myclobutanol and Captan. Mancozeb is a material that some folks use. It's got long days to harvest, 77 days at least till between the last application and harvest. But that one has been effective. Nice thing about Mancozeb and Captan is that you really don't get resistance against that. Myclobutanol is a more systemic type, and so you have to use that more judiciously, but it is very effective if you don't overuse it. And then you get into the summer diseases. Black rot is one of them, and then you need to kind of go back and look, well, which of these materials works pretty good. Captan is a pretty good material for summer diseases. So that's kind of what I would say in terms of disease control. Again, I could spend a whole hour just talking about that. Now, in terms of insects and insecticides, again, we're trying to protect the fruit, especially at the early stages. And there's a lot of materials out there, and there are more organic options out there. Organic tend to be shorter-lived materials, but they can be very effective. Imidan is kind of used to be very widely used by the commercial growers. There is some resistance against codling moth against Imidan, but in places where you don't overuse it, it also has a long days pre-harvest interval in it. Malathion has been used quite a bit. 7 has been used quite a bit. Pyrethrin is one that has short-term duration effects, but it breaks down relatively quickly. So you really the pest really needs to be hit pretty directly with this in order for it to work. Horticultural oils, useful against scale, but it also, if you choose the summer oils, it can do a fairly decent job of controlling some of especially the aphid materials. You have to use these materials fairly carefully because there is a potential for burning if the conditions make the leaves more sensitive. Neem oil is kind of the same category. It's a little bit more harsh than a horticultural oil, so you have to use that one a little bit cautiously. BTs is Bacillus thuringiensis, which is a disease for the various caterpillars. That one, it takes a fair number of applications to do a good cover, but it is effective material for the larva type. And surround is a kind of neat technique. Is kaolin clay, which is a active ingredient in kale pectate, and so it is a fine coating of clay that's on the surface, and a lot of insects don't like to crawl around in it. It doesn't really kill the insect, but it just makes a miserable place for them to be. on the leaf surface. So that's as much time as I have to talk about the disease and insect control. So at this point, why don't we take a short break here, and people, I'll stop covering new material, but we have an opportunity for the questions and answers, if Elizabeth, if any of them were presented or people wanted. So I'll turn this over to you, Elizabeth, for kind of emceeing this section.
Okay, I don't have any quick questions out of the group chat. People would like to have the slideshow available, though I don't know if they'll be available or not. If I can send that out if people are interested or not.
Or you were planning to make the
Video.
recording available.
Right, right. So they were wondering if you could do if they could print the PowerPoint out, you know, for printing.
Yeah, let's see. I have a Weebly site that I post these things on. So what I can do is I can give you the link to where it'll be posted.
Sure, and I can make that available. There is a question that came in, curious on how homeowners might apply these products to well-established trees.
Yeah,
the young ones.
Yeah, you mean the various insecticide and fungicides?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's the tricky part, especially if you got like a 25-foot tree, and it's you know, propelling stuff that high is difficult. There's some people will get by with the hose system where you spray. You have a bottle with the mixed up material and you spray it that way. I myself am not a great fan of that because it's really hard to stay out of the spray with that system. You know, a pump up sprayer is really not up to the task. You need on the order of, for a decent sized tree, 2 to 4 gallons of spray. So that's to me a lot of work for one tree. It could be done. Then you're off to various types of pressurized system, and those get a little more expensive. Things that you would pull with your tractor. There are controlled applicator types that are battery powered that really don't have enough horsepower to get the material up in the tree. So I don't have a lot of great options for you without a fairly significant investment in some sort of spraying equipment. Yeah, but now if you have dwarf trees, and this is one of the great arguments for planting dwarf trees, you certainly can do that with a pump up sprayer. You know, assuming that you don't have 20 or 30 or 40 or half acre trees, and then you're back to a powered equipment of some type. So there are various things that you can pull with a with a small lawn mower, you know, with a hitch that work fairly decently. There's if you go to the University of Kentucky website and look at backyard gardening, they have a pretty good breakdown of material of equipment that could be used. So so just University of Kentucky backyard gardening, and you'll get to some what I consider really nice information about spraying systems.
Another question, I guess along those lines, were could you prune them smaller, so the well-established trees? And I think you're going to get into pruning in here, so we'll see if that gets answered. Okay. And then another question too. I know you mentioned a lot of things regarding the temperature and so forth of the area where you're growing your trees. And someone was wondering about East Jordan, so quite a bit further north. I'm assuming there's maps and things available where those folks could look and see what their length of day is and what their temperatures are, and that would be useful in selecting trees.
Yeah, it's there is the map that I showed you with the zones in Michigan. That's probably as good as you're going to get in terms of looking at the broad effect. I think what you might hope for in your planting site is that you're on a hill. And that would make a big difference in terms of how successful you were. That becomes more important than how close you are to the lake when you get up into that area.
Okay, and there was one more question. Somebody was asking about new varieties of like hardy apricots. Is that something that you know anything about, and would that be something you could recommend?
Yeah, I do have a list that I can send. There's some new ones that have come out of New Jersey. So if you use my email to ask me that question, then I'll be glad to send that list.
Okay, maybe I can make that available as well. Okay, that's it for the questions that I have at this point.
Okay. So, okay, you ready to keep on going? We're going to go into tree fruit culture, and starting with pollination. There's kind of two general categories: trees that need a pollinator and that don't need it, or ones that need it. And the stone fruit generally, well, some of the stone fruit, peaches, nectarines, apricots, tart cherries, do pretty well without a partner variety to provide the pollen. Ones that generally do need it are apples, pears, sweet cherries, plums, nut crops. Now, there are some exceptions. There are some self-fertile sweet cherries, and there are a few semi-fertile apple varieties. But for the most part, and plums, there's some that are somewhat self-fertile. But it's for those, you're probably better off finding a pollen source for the variety. And for all types, encouraging bee or pollinators, insects, or wind, having wind to move pollen through the nut crops. And in choosing varieties, there are these guides that are available about what are compatible varieties. And this is an old one from Hilltop Nursery over by Hartford. And it kind of illustrates the point for European plums, where you kind of match up the varieties along the vertical across the horizontal, and you see which ones will work as a good pollinator. And for example, if you think of the variety poly being a source of pollen, it provides pollen for a wide range of plums. For the most part, the variety on itself, like Castleton, by itself doesn't do real great. So there's a lot of ones that are somewhat compatible, so early blue, for example, sort of works. You also have to consider when things bloom, because if you have an early blooming variety and a late blooming variety, if you have a cool spring, sometimes you can run into a situation that the early ones are done blooming before the later ones start to bloom, and so then they don't help each other. So for the newer varieties, some of this information is scanty. You have to kind of dig around for that, and but there are some fairly good sites for providing this information. So if you do pollination fruit trees as web search, you'll find some of these ones that are fairly useful. Okay, that's for pollination. Now I want to talk about tree structure a bit, and I'm focusing on apples here. There's kind of two general categories of trees, non-spur types and spur types. A spur is a small branch on a fruit tree that grows slowly each year. So on the right, we have Red Delicious, and you can see how wrinkled looking these little branches here, they're called spurs. And that's because these are several years old. These can be 8 years old or more. And whereas the non-spur types generally will not develop these spurs, and quite often they will produce their fruit buds on the end of branches, which is kind of interesting because it ends up being like a weeping willow effect to the tree, because the fruit on the end of that develop on the end of the branch pull the branch down, and then the new growth is kind of upwards, and so we get that drooping look that we get with, say, a Rome or Macintosh, whereas the spur types tend to be upright. And it does make a difference in terms of the pruning strategies for the tree, because these tend to get all bound up with a lot of short little spurs, and so the tree runs out of, doesn't have enough leaves to produce good quality fruit. Whereas these ones, shading is quite often a problem because they droop over and hide the fruit, and so we have lesser quality there. So this is important, and some of these can be very tortuous. Bartlett pears, you look how all these little spurs here. So you can get way too much spurs on some things. Red delicious can be in the same way, and so sometimes one of the great strategies is do what we call spur extinction. Basically, we take a hand in a leather glove and or a lopper handle, and then go through and just take out half of these spurs here, so that we get into a reasonable number of potential fruiting sites. So again, appreciation for that helps. Cherries is a kind of a different situation, and this is shows you a sweet cherry, and you can shows you the view at the end of the season, or maybe in the early spring before growth has started. The growth that occurred in this, if you look at the far right in this branch end, looking upwards, is the new growth. And then if you go back in, you start to see these spurs, like I said here. And sometimes you'll get fruit on these, the ends here on the lateral buds, but more often they tend to be on these clusters here. So this is makes a difference on what you prune. And again, you run into the same problem with this: is get too many spurs, too many fruit, and not enough leaves, and so a tree suffers. So peaches are another situation too, where they develop their fruit buds on last year's growth. So this grew last year. So this is the only place where we're going to see the fruit buds. So if you do a real aggressive job in cutting off new growth, you basically will knock out your peach crop if you're not careful. Whereas if you go back to the cherries and you do the pruning on the end of the branch, you've not really affected the fruit load that much. So you kind of have to adopt a training strategy based on that. Another anatomy thing I bring to your attention is this idea of growth rings on a tree. And this relates to the development that happens each year. Here's a branch here that shows 4 years worth of growth. And then if you scrutinize it, you'll see these little rings here. And this shows on the right picture here where the arrow is, shows you this kind of rings. And where that comes from is that at the end of the bud scale scars, buds they clasp around that tip of the branch, and then when they fall off, then that leaves these little scars here. So this provides a kind of a neat way to be able to age a branch by you just look for these scars, and then allows you to in the case of cherry, you would be able to know what was your new growth, what's your older growth. So it's a kind of anatomy thing to kind of keep you up to, you can figure out how much growth you're getting per year. We like on apples trees see at least 1.5 feet of new growth each year, and so you can figure that out. Another characteristic is the sign and rootstock. concept. Fruit trees are all grafted, meaning that the two parts were put together to make that tree. The top part, the part that we like to eat, is the scion. The rootstock is what provides support. It sometimes provides dwarfing effects, might have disease resistance. So the nurseries will, or somebody that does it themselves, will form this by putting these two together by grafting or by budding. So, and the point between the two we call the graft union. That's where the tree was put together. And so to give you a quick look at that, this shows tea budding, and this may be old news to a lot of you here, but basically you take a piece of bark with a leaf bud, a vegetative bud, and you put it into a slot that's made into the tissue here. It shows you a little bit of the knife that's kind of used to usher that in there. And then it heals in, it's wrapped, it heals in. Then in the springtime, we cut off this part right above that bud and allow it to grow. So this becomes the new top of the tree. This is the graft union area, and this is the new top of the tree. And quite often we'll see a little dog leg where that took place because of that. The bud first grows sideways and then eventually it kind of straightens out. So that allows us to figure out where that is. But it's important, there's another type of tree out there that's called a bench graft tree. And that one's put together differently. And what they do is start out with the rootstock, and what they'll do, instead of putting a bud onto that rootstock, they'll put a piece of wood. It'll be several, 3-4 inches long, that's grafted in there. And then when the nursery lets this thing start to grow, the graft union is right where where you put the bud in here, but in this case, the bud starts at the top of this little scion piece here. So if you're trying to figure out how deep to plant the thing, you have to really pay attention to where that graft union is, because certain trees like peaches, you don't like to get that graft union too deep in the soil. So if you said, okay, the graft union must be here where we have this growth starting, you plant it too deep and this graft union is way down to the soil, and you can run into problems from that. One of the major reasons in apples why we do that is to control the size of the tree. And this dwarfing rootstock was a great innovation, really transformed fruit growing. So if you go with something like M27 size rootstock, you get an 8-foot tree at maturity. The old days, you get 30-foot size trees. The difference is these dwarfing rootstocks do require staking, otherwise with a fruit load they might tip over. Whereas these older ones, these more non-dwarfing types, may not need it. Same is true with pears. We have 3 rootstocks that we commonly use. Bartlett seedling rootstock, there's Oldham Farmingdale 97 or 87. Those are the ones we tend to use. And the 97 doesn't do that much dwarfing, but the 87 does about a 70% of a full-size tree, so it helps. And but we don't have any what I consider real great dwarfing rootstock for pears. Sweet cherries, a great innovation has been the Gisela rootstock, and whereas we could have a 30-foot tree, the old style, but if you have a Gisela 6, then you have 80%, or Gisela 5 can be half the size. And there's a new ones coming out of Michigan State University named after counties that look to have good dwarfing characteristics. So, and we don't have a good one for peaches and apricots. Okay, on to, and also in addition to rootstock, variety makes a difference on the size of the tree. I kind of hinted about that, talking about Red Delicious. Also, if you have a very vigorous, lush soil, then the trees tend to be bigger. Sandy soils tend to restrict. Okay, planting fruit trees. For bare root trees, things that come with no real soil associated, maybe some mulch around it to keep it moist when it's being transported from the nursery or mailed. Um, Spring planting is generally preferred. Fall, if you're careful, you can do it in the fall time. You just have, when you plant a tree in the fall time, you have to make sure that the roots stay covered. Um, and but the ornamental nursery is kind of set up for fall planting. But if you have a ball tree or container grown tree, you can plant those anytime. But it's better to do that in the spring or fall. And the spring, yeah, depending on when you can get the best tree for your money, it has a lot to do with it. General tips: this is where it's like a tomato. Don't want to let the roots dry out. You don't be afraid of cutting off if there's some damaged root tips. Very important not to, if you got the holes a little bit too small, don't wrap your roots around to fit it into the hole, because they will continue that roundabout and have a choking effect on later on when the roots get big diameter. And as you're filling the hole, tamp it gently, and watering as you're going along helps to settle the soil around the root system. And check it over to the next few days. And again, pay attention to the graft union, because for apples and pears, particularly for apples with dwarfing rootstock, you want to have that graft union above the soil. And so this kind of gives you a look at that. Quite often we'll see a swelling associated with the graft union, aiming at 2 to 3 inches when the trees settle down. And if you have a sandy soil, if you really loosen the soil, it may sink down a bit. So you may want to aim a little bit higher, hoping that'll end up being about 3 inches. And with again, this is apples and pears. With cherries, peaches, and plums, we generally plant those with bud unions closer to the soil line. Now, if you have a dwarfing rootstock with cherries, it's probably better to have it a little bit above the soil, but it's not as critical. The reason for that has to do with this idea of scion rooting. And scion rooting means that the scion was planted so deep that it was in contact with the soil, and it was able to send out roots into the soil. The soil was pulled away from this to expose what was going on. And what happens is that you lose any dwarfing effect that you might have expected from the rootstock. And so you end up having a huge tree where you're hoping to have a smaller tree. And so with this, a general rule of thumb is when you get the tree from the nursery, look to see where the last root is, and then plant it so that the soil is slightly above that. And again, don't be fooled on this bench graft versus budded trees. It's always a good idea to stake trees that are dwarf type, but even larger trees, particularly if you leave a lot of wood at planting, you may want to watch it, decide whether you need to stake the trees. A lot of different ways to do that, but if you don't need to stake it, then I wouldn't, because the tree actually settles in a little bit better with a little bit of with wind waggling the tree. Tree wraps is a good idea for the winter time, not so much for the summertime, because it tends to encourage insect and kind of rot problems there. Alternative is to use white latex paint on the base of the trunk for protection against the sun beating down in the wintertime. Also, if you use herbicides, the latex paint helps somewhat for protecting, and use a cage to keep the rodents away from the trunk. And that's mainly what the tree guards over here on the left do. Also, you can make it yourself with a hardware cloth, making sure that the mesh on that is small enough diameter so that small rodents, mice can't get in there. So that works pretty well. In general, if you use these tree wraps, I recommend you take them off in the summertime. If you know that you're not going to get around to it, then I would suggest something like a painted tree with a vole guard. Latex paint doesn't help against when we get the -13, -17 degree temperatures, and it's so with that, you don't have a lot of protection out there. Pruning tools, I like the pica pruners. Felcos are pretty good too. Just stay away from the anvil type because they kind of crush the material when you prune. It's not a big deal, but if you're going to buy something, you know, I would get something that's best. Pruning in general and young trees to shape the trees, to reduce the crop, so that you can devote on building that tree and not steal the growth away from making fruit. Older trees, taking out dead stuff, getting light into the inside of the tree is important in an older tree. Shape of the tree, controlling the tree height, and also thinning the crop, kind of general objectives. Again, best time to prune is February, March, April. Older trees are tougher. You can do them on the early side, February. There are some guys that will prune in December, but that's generally not a good idea if we get caught by a temperature drop. Younger trees, I tend to like to prune them close to the bloom time. Some folks that have very sensitive things like peaches will wait till after bloom and prune it, because when you prune shortly before bloom and you get low temperatures, the things that have been pruned are more sensitive to fruit bud death. We saw that this past growing season. When you plant your trees, the big decision what to do in terms of leaving the branches or keeping them off. Whipping is a strategy where you take the branches off. Main reason that you do it is that they were not happy with the structure of the limbs. You can hedge your bets and leave stubs. Especially if you're planting a larger diameter tree that are somewhat less apt to send out growth. If you're questioning at all how good quality the trees are, leave a little bit more of a stub. The idea is this allows you to choose where you want the branches to be, because quite often the branches positions that you get in the nursery are really poor. In general, you like to train it so that you have wide angles on your tree trunks. Try to avoid these what we call co-dominant same-size branches, because they tend to be weak. So work to have wide angles and avoid these forks. Clothespins work pretty well for training wide angle branches. You clamp them onto the base of the tree, and the tails put the branches outwards. You do this when you get shoots that are about 4 inches long, and then you remove them, about a month later, and by that time the growth is at the right angle. Start out with more branches than you need, so you have choices later. Important concept for training trees is this apical dominance. That is, the top bud on the tree kind of keeps the other buds downhill from growing. So if you chop off that top bud, what it does is it releases those lower buds and allows them to grow. And this is when you're trying to rejuvenate a tree that's just stopped growing. Doing these type of heading cuts helps. At planting, if you're planting trees where they're on a non-dwarfing rootstock, you want to have fairly robust limbs coming off. Then heading, it allows you to get strong branches coming out below where you put the heading cut. So if you hadn't made that heading cut here, then all your branches would tend to be right up here on the top, and you might have had a bare zone or area that was really poor for branch development. So this allows you to get that tree to grow. And after you do the heading cut, you can come through and see where the growth is happening, and you can do some selective pruning, say a month after you did that heading cut. So tweaking the tree is always a good idea. So we've talked about the two type of cuts: the heading cut, where that kind of stimulates the local growth here. Then the other thing is thinning cuts, where you take out whole branches, and that's where you're trying to get light into an older tree. And again, the effect of a heading cut is that you get a lot of growth close to where the cut was made. The buds that are close to that heading cut are released and allowed to grow. Now this is what I call a road crew cut, or a flat top cut, because tree service guys or power line guys come along and flat top the tree. And what happens, you get a lot of growth where they made the cuts, and it shades the lower part of the trees, and you lose the growth down here. So it really does a disservice especially for an older tree. Younger, again, if you take out these whole limbs, then you don't get this real localized stimulation of growth. It's lightened the tree. You get better quality of the remaining limbs of interior growth. So this is something you do on an older tree. And another concept is this idea of hierarchy within the tree. Kind of think of the tree, the trunk of the tree as being the king or the primary. Then the branches that come off of it should be smaller in diameter, and then the branches that come off of that should be smaller. If you think about that, then that allows you to do pruning decisions on the trees, trying to maintain that in the tree. And you get less problems with splits, codominant limbs that I talked about. And okay, I want to talk about a few train systems. Central leader, so it's like a Christmas tree, and it's a very common one for trees that are more vigorous rootstock and kind of a pyramid shape to it. And so I showed you that doing the heading cut at planting time to get the branches down here, get more than you need, and then you trim it back to 3 to 5 in that zone. And then you would do that again and get another tier of branches up here. So that's the system. Again, this system is tried and true method. So this shows you what happens when this shows you the second growing season. The first growing season, there was a cut that was made here, and these are the branches that were selective. And the top bud was the dominant one, and it grew quite a bit. And so in order to get another set of branches here, then in the springtime, we need a heading cut there to kind of start it again. And so you get this type of thing with a central leader tree, a tier here, maybe a tier here. And you get spaces between the branches, which allows the light to get in. And you can have a central leader tree where you actually have bare zones here. And that, again, lets the light in. Either system works. For peaches, using a open center is the way to go, kind of a hole here, and you start out with stubs, and then you let certain stubs grow, and then you select to the 3 or 4 branches in this zone right here. And you kind of keep an eye on it so that you only have those major ones, and kind of keep it open, keep the growth out of the center. And if you realize that you had too many branches there, then you come through and nip some of them out. And you get into a problem situation if you didn't do that early on, because you get so many here, you get canker problems from just areas where the water collects. You get pockets of ice, and so that's a tree that tends to live less long. So I'll finish up with a few kind of a more mature tree, and thank Elizabeth for giving me some of these. And here's a situation where we have upright tree, a lot of growth here. Maybe had deer issues that pruned it lower down, or maybe wanted to keep it away from the riding mower. But so looking at that tree, the thoughts says, well, there's just too much going on here. So the thing to do, what we don't want are heading cuts, because that would just make the inside of it even more shaded. So this is the desirable thing here, is go through and take out maybe half of these limbs here, cutting back. And that way we get better growth, better fruit development inside the tree. So that's the strategy with that. Here's a peach tree, and you can see it's kind of the same situation where we have lots and lots of growth. And so we have a situation where what we should do is go through and thin it. And so it's not a real drastic set of cuts, but the tree will benefit. Here's a older apple tree that hasn't had a lot of pruning, and can go 20, 30 years in the same way. But if you want better quality fruit, easier to prune, get spray material in to pick, better color, then you go through and do thinning cuts. And the same is true here. The other point that I make is if you're wanting to bring the height of the tree down, it is important when you make these cuts, you find a strong side limb and you cut to it so that that side limb is untouched. And so the side limb kind of keeps control of that area to keep it from doing that heading cut type of effect. Again, find a strong side limb that is aiming upward and cut back to it. And then if you don't try to bring the tree down all in 1 year, work at it through a couple successive years, and it's easier on the tree. Neglected tree, kind of the same before and after. You can see that it's going to took out a lot of wood. I maybe would have done 2 years to do this, but this would work. And so it's a way to get the trees growing well. Here's a kind of a different situation. This is a dwarf cherry tree, and you notice here that there's a lot of bare areas on the limbs here, and this kind of relates back to what I talked about, the different areas of the branch of the cherry tree. And what we have is this: when a dwarf cherry tree develops, there is sometimes a tendency for the tree to have fruit buds on the last year's growth, on what we call the lateral growth. So if you get a lot of these things flowering, and the dwarfing rootstock really kind of promotes that, what happens is that with a bud like a cherry bud or peach bud, apricot bud, it's either a fruit bud or a leaf bud. And if it's a fruit bud, then that does it. That next year you won't get anything growing in that site. Whereas in these compound areas here, there's a combination of fruit and leaf buds. And so if you have fruit here, there still are leaf buds here. So what happened up here is that we had fruiting going on these lateral buds because the tree had too much tendency to do that, to form buds here. So to kind of kick it out of that mode, you have to do heading cuts in this situation to stimulate more vigorous growth. And it'll take a couple of years to see the benefit out of that. So we covered through a lot of material. I went a little bit past the allotted time. I hope that's okay. But I'd be glad to answer any questions that come up. Here's my contact information here that you're welcome to get in contact with me if I can help you out. Also, most of you may be aware of this, but there's a nice feature online called Ask an Expert, and you can get on there and ask questions, and it really does a nice job in finding the experts within Michigan and elsewhere to come and answer your question. And if you're not satisfied with that, you can come back and say, well, I want more information, and then if they need to, they can find somebody else that might have some more answers to that. Also, you can submit pictures, which are really good in diagnosing problems. So with that, Elizabeth, I'll turn it back to you. And again, you've been a very quiet audience because all your microphones are turned off. So here's your chance.
Yes, we don't have any other questions in the chat. If anybody'd like to quick ask one in the chat or raise your hand, we'd be happy to answer any questions. And while we're waiting to see if somebody's interested in asking any questions, actually I did have one. There was one talk about a plum tree whose top died off during the polar vortex. Can it be saved, or is there something that we should do about that?
Well, the first question would be, is there still some of the scion left? Because if it killed off the scion and all you have is rootstock, and usually plum is a myrobalan rootstock, which is a miserable thorny thing. So you'd be better off, you know, not starting over rather than trying to get fruit out of that thing. You know, yeah, the myrobalan has a small little, well, it's a very mild fruit, but you can't always predict what you're going to get because it's grown from seed for many cases. So, so look to see if you have two different leaf types up there. The myrobalan, if you still have the true plum variety growing, you can try encouraging that. But if it's mainly just seems to be rootstock growing, then I would start over. In the long run, I think you'd be happier doing that.
Okay, there's another question here. How much is too much to remove from a tree in a single season of pruning?
Well, the bigger the tree, the older the tree, the more you can get away with. And the other, so if you're it's a mature tree, I tend not to want to take more than, say, a fourth or a fifth off at one time. So plan, if you need to do some fairly drastic work on a tree, plan on getting that done over a 3 to 5 year period of time. If you need to reduce the height of the tree, that's going to be fairly drastic to the tree. And finding that boss limb to cut to is pretty important. And it's best to do, if you're going to do sizable pruning on the tree, do that in the March, April period of time. You don't want to cut a tree very severely in the summertime and especially in the fall time, because that weakens the tree going into the winter. If you have a harsh winter, then that increases the chances that the tree might not pull through.
Let's see, we've got a couple more questions. How closely should you plant pear trees? And are there plants that should not be near that tree that would inhibit growth?
What was the last question again?
Yep.
I mean, last
Sure.
half of it.
Are there plants that should not be near that would inhibit growth?
Oh, pear trees tend to be fairly aggressive growers because for the most part, we don't have a good, most nurseries you'll get pear trees that are on Bartlett seedling rootstock. And you know, I have grown pear trees 10 feet apart and they've been happy. It depends a little bit on the variety on top. If you have something like Harold Sweet as a variety, that tends to fruit a lot and inhibits the growth. If you have something that is less reliable of a bearer, then you want to plant them a little further apart because you can't depend on the fruit to inhibit the growth. So I would say that, and if you have a sandy soil, you can be a little bit closer together. If they're heavier soil, then I'd have them farther apart. So I think you're looking at a 10 to 15 foot apart. As far as trees that you shouldn't have near pear trees, other than shading, I don't think it's the big issue. Black walnuts, offhand, I don't know whether pear trees are bothered by black walnuts. So unless, other than something like that, that's the only problem that I could see planting something close.
Okay, we now have a question about old legacy farm apple trees are neglected that haven't been pruned for over 10 years. Are there things that I should absolutely not do when pruning for the first time?
Are these old trees or are these moderate sized trees? Because it would depend on the size of the tree.
They're old. They're very old.
Very old. Okay, you can get away with quite a bit, is, you know, assuming that you're seeing decent growth each year. And if it, and you really, I think finding somebody that knows how to do a chainsaw safely and concentrate on maybe 2, 3, 4 chainsaw cuts. Again, trying to take out whole limbs rather than heading cuts. So yeah, and then when you make your big cuts, try to cut to a strong side limb so that you maintain, you know, control of the regrowth on the tree. And you kind of work with what you got, and sometimes you don't have a lot of options out there. But thinning cuts are the way to go. And yeah, so yeah.
If there's a central leader, would that be wise to take that out?
If there's a reason that you really are not happy with the height of the tree, the problem is if you have that same, you still need to have a boss on the tree. If you can cut that central leader down and the branches that you leave that are at the new apex of the tree, if they're uphill, if they are towering over where you made that cut, then they will kind of control that area somewhat. Now, but if you don't have a real good side branch to cut to, then I probably not do a heading cut unless, yeah. So boss limbs are your friend.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Is there a good resource for learning grafting?
I mean, there's a lot of good videos online for that.
Maybe you could give me the names and I can pass those out.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, I can do the links.
Yeah, there's a lot of different techniques for grafting.
Okay.
And it depends, yeah.
Okay. Another question was about the fruit and nut listserv. Are you aware of that? And then how would people join that? Or is that another link you could give to me and I can pass that along?
I'm sorry, what was the
fruit and nut listserv?
I don't use it that much. I'm aware of it. I have other resources.
Okay.
Yeah, so
I think somebody who was listening was on the fruit. They said they follow the fruit and nut listserv. If you could email me at the conservation district, I can pass that out as well.
Yeah, that'd be good. I mean, there's lots of good information. Sometimes it's finding it.
Right. Okay, anybody else have any other questions? Okay, well, I want to thank you all for attending this program. I'd like to especially thank Bill for sharing all this information. Been very informative, and hopefully we can all get out there and grow a few fruit trees in our backyards. And we wish everyone good luck in all of your gardening adventures. I will follow up, send out an email and follow up with contact and any links and so forth as well. Thank you. Thanks, Bill. Bye-bye.